Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In this tutorial we are taking you through how to create and position a pattern on the back of your hand, a little bit like this one here. So let's get underway. First thing I did was just to do some sketches. Initially I was quite taken with the idea of having something that was quite symmetrical, but I couldn't really sort of settle on a particular pattern or particular design, and then I sort of started to look at sort of broguing patterns and things like that they do on shoes, and I really liked those effects. So I had a sort of an idea of maybe doing something a little bit more asymmetrical, and having just sort of trying that out, and that's actually what I ended up kind of hitting on. So I found and sort of worked up a sort of a particular shape that I like the look of and sort of sketched it out in my book. On the back of the trank I'd actually created a sort of square from where my sort of just after the base of my fingers are finished, and I was going to use that as a sort of a placement guide to help me then work out the size and shape of what I would need to do to create that particular pattern. I didn't just want to go straight onto my card. I wanted to sort of just work it out on tracing paper first to make sure that I was happy before I committed to gluing everything on top of the card, because if, for example, it went wrong, it would be really frustrating to try and replace it. So on the back of the card where I'd created that grid, I then traced off the sort of overall square shape that I was going to use, and that gave me a sort of a rough idea of the size. And I'd also rather cheekily just measured that very roughly as I was sort of starting to finalise the design. So the sketches I started to draw were actually in the size of what I wanted to have as my sort of final piece. So I then popped my tracing paper on and traced the design onto the tracing paper, and this is where you can make any adjustments. I think I wanted to sort of just refine some of the curves a little bit more and just sort of have a little go at sort of working it out and sort of how it might look. So tracing the design on is the next step, and then we're going to move on to practicing it. So I've played about with my shape, and I think on my original sketch I had the sort of tail of my stem sort of pointing upwards. I didn't particularly like that effect when I drew it out on paper, so I've sort of played about with it. I've refined it, I've rubbed out some lines to make sure that I know that they're not going to confuse me, and I've just extended the sort of tail down and out, and I think that just gives the design a nice little bit of flow. I've also marked on the top and the base. It may sound obvious, but it is really frustrating if you sort of glue something on in the sort of wrong orientation. So I would always advise doing a little test practice first, and just making sure that you are happy with the effect that you then get on the leather. So I'm going to do a little test piece first, and I'm then going to sort of show you how I would then test it and then also put it onto the leather once I'm happy with the design and the overall effect, of course. So we're glued on, and now the next thing to do is for me to mark out where I want the holes to go, and to do that I find it really useful to use a pair of dividers. Now I know that I didn't want, when I was punching my holes, to have really sort of big holes, but I would like them to be sort of fairly regularly spaced and sort of fairly well organised over my design. So with my dividers, I've set these particular dividers to 1/2 centimetre, and when I'm sort of planning the width, I've also got to remember that when you punch your holes, you want to be punching through the centre of the mark that you make so that your holes are completely consistent. So you've got to allow in the sort of the width of the hole that you're making as well. So to just get that underway, I have sort of these set up, and I think I've got 1/2 centimetre, but I just want to check. So I'm just going to score along the paper, and I'm then going to just measure with my ruler, and I can see the score line is probably a bit too faint for the camera to pick up, but I can see that I am exactly 1/2 centimetre, which is really handy. So if you were sort of doing slightly bigger holes, you might find that you need to make your holes further apart, but you know, that'll sort of become evident as you go along as well. So I'm going to start at the base of my stem, and I'm going to basically sort of walk my dividers along the line. So as I'm walking along, I'm sort of keeping one end down while I spin the other, and spin that end that's down, so that in effect I can then walk up the stem that I've created. So I'm going to go along and I'm going to do the stem first, and then I'm going to come back and do the leaves. So all I'm doing is just walking that along. If you happen to catch it, don't panic, just flatten it out, and you're going to come back, walk all the way along up, and then conveniently where I've ended, where my stem split, there's already a mark, so I can then, when I come back to do the other stem, I can basically keep going, and I'm going to walk my dividers around both of the stems and then come back and do the leaves. And what I might do with the leaves, because I don't want too many holes forming around where the leaves meet the stem, is I'm going to start the leaves just at the tip of the leaf and work back towards the base, because then I can decide whether or not I actually want to put an extra hole in the base there as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to get all of those marked up, and then I can show you the next stage. So I've finished with the marking out all where the holes are going to go, at 1/2 centimetre apart, and I've gone all the way around the stems. I've started the leaves at the tip of the leaf and worked back towards the stem. I haven't marked in the last sort of 2 holes where this leaf meets the stem. If I just do that quickly and show you, you will probably hopefully see that it means I'm going to have quite a lot of holes or marks near the base, so they are coming together quite here, and what I don't want to do is end up with a massive hole. I also found that the last hole on my stem, if I marked it a true 1/2 centimetre, I could see that I'm just beyond the end of my stem. So you have to make a judgment call. I'm happy with the position of that hole, and that will mark the end of my line. Using my awl, I'm going to now poke through and create the holes. When I transfer the markings onto leather, I'm actually going to be using my silver pen. So I just need a size of hole that's big enough for my pen to go through comfortably to mark the leather. As I'm punching, I want to keep my awl vertical. I don't want to angle it. I'm going in, I'm probably not punching very far. Probably, if I can just show you, you get a sort of sense that I'm probably less than 1/2 centimetre I'm actually punching through. So I'm not pushing the awl the whole way in to get the full length of the full width of the awl. I'm actually just very carefully making the holes. Now if you get to a mark and you think, oh, that's slightly out, I might want to sort of move that a little bit. Now is the time to move it. This one here for me just looks a little bit to where the left of where I actually want it to be. So I'm just going to bring it back onto the stem and mark where I want it to go. I'm then going to do the same with any others that I think are a little bit off, and just keep going all the way up the stem around the top of the design and also for the leaves. So I'm just trying to keep everything nice and vertical. I'm going to finish making my way around, and then I'm going to show you what to do with the other side. So I've punched my holes, I've gone all the way around following the shape of my design. I'm now going to flip it over, coming onto the back, and I just want to insert the awl again in through the holes, just to sort of really open up both sides of the hole. So I'm going to just work my way around, and with this one you'll be able to see a little bit more where if you've missed a hole, because it just won't be as open as the rest. So again, I'm not pushing my awl all the way in. I'm probably going to about a depth of about 1/2 centimetre or so, and I am just going to work my way around the design and make the holes a little bit wider so they're equal from both sides. because that will allow me, ultimately, if I decide to use this design, it will allow me the chance to flip it nice and easily as well. So I've pushed through all my holes, and I've ringed one that I noticed was quite close to another hole here. Now if I punch that out, I'm going to run the risk of creating quite a big hole there, which perhaps I don't really want. I actually picked it up when I was working on the back, and I know some of you may have picked it up a little bit sooner, so I am probably going to take a little bit of artistic license and leave this hole out. The main stem sort of goes up and around, and this one sort of comes off, and I think I'll be able to sort of get away with that, because I don't want to have a big hole caused by punching both of those out. So I'm going to do a test piece anyway, and I can work this out. I've got a scrap bit of leather, and I just want to check that my leather is going to be big enough for what I want to do, and it will be. So I'm not particularly worried at this point about the angle of the leather or where the stretch is, because I just want to have a look at the pattern that we're going to be punching. So once you've checked your leather out, you are then going to just take your pen and you're going to make a little dot through each of the holes. And obviously remember as well where your leaves are. Check that you've done everything before you lift your template off. So I'm just going to work my way along. I can just check, and I know it's difficult for me to show you, but yeah, you can just see a little bit there that the marks have gone through, and that's all I need. And I'm just going to work my way along, ignoring that one because that's a little bit close, and there's also one on the leaf that's on the right hand side of the design that I think I will also just have another look at. The whole point of doing a sample really does enable you to see where there are problems, where you might need to make some tweaks, and I did, when I did an earlier design, have to make a few tweaks, and this is the hole that's concerning me. So again, I'm probably going to leave that one out. I'll take a little bit of artistic license. I know it's right down the bottom of the screen. If I move it at this point, I run the risk of sliding off the leather, which I don't particularly want to do. So we'll check it when we've completed all of our dots. So 2 out of a pattern isn't too bad, but we'll see what we can do. Sometimes you might find that you can move the dots and just take a little bit of artistic license with some of the distances. Sometimes it's best to leave it out. Again, it's always sort of slightly tricky sometimes to work out what to do, which is where sampling is really helpful. So I've taken off the template that I've created, and you can see that we've got a series of dots underneath. If any of them just look a little bit like they're not particularly clear, now is a good time to just make sure that you ink them in before we go on to the next stage. Sometimes you've got to almost sort of bob your head up and down a bit and just sort of move slightly differently with the light to check that everything is in the right place, and then we're going to move on to the punching. So before I start punching the design I've just made, I'm going to just make a series of dots on my sample bit of leather, because I want to show you a little nifty technique to help get a nice accurate hole. I tend to use a poly block under where I'm punching with a piece of scrap leather on top, and then I will punch through my holes onto that, and that just helps to preserve the end of your punch. One of the reasons why I did some of the little dots onto the leather was to show you a good way of working out if your punch is in the correct condition. So I'm just going to zoom in, and I just want to show you this in a little bit more detail. So the dots will be in focus, but the punch won't be. So if I show you on one of the larger punches, if we wanted to punch out any of these dots, we want to make sure that the dot is in the center of the punch. To do that, I can just pop my punch on as though I'm going to make an impression in the leather. So my hole will be slightly off center if I punched it into that particular part here. If I will then adjust it, so what you can do, and it's a useful tip for, is just to make that impression. So when you're punching, make an impression, and then you can just move your hand over slightly until you are happy that you're in the right position. Once you're happy, punch, and then you will get your hole punched out with your dot in the middle. And if you apply that to the remaining dots, you will have a nice smooth design. So light impression, and because this is a chrome tanned leather, I can do that without it actually marking the leather. If you're using a veg tan leather, just be careful not to make too many marks. So it takes a little while to get your eye in, but once your eye is in, you will be away, and you can then just punch, making sure that you keep the punch upright, do your little impression, and just work your way along the design. So we've had a bit of practice at punching and making our marks, and I've had a go at punching out the design. I did try some of the different size punches, and perhaps I accidentally have discovered that starting with quite a wide punch and working your way up to your narrow ones does give quite a nice effect. Maybe that's something for a future design. But I also found that as I got up the stem, I quite liked the slightly more finer, smaller holes, and then also just sort of tried different size ones for the sort of top of the stems and also the leaves. One thing to be careful of is to make sure that you don't rest your hand on the leather as you're punching, because otherwise you can rub off your marks, which is really quite frustrating. I also found that I quite liked a smaller punch with a smaller hole for the leaves and the next size up for the stem. So if I remember rightly, these are very small. This is 1.5 and 1 mil. So this is very fine. This is 1.5 millimeters. But they do give some really nice holes. Now, if you notice the shape of the punch, you want to be hammering your punch in just enough to create a hole. As these punches get a little wider as you go further up the handle, what you don't want to be doing is trying to really hit it incredibly hard, because your punch will then go into the leather and will create a hole that becomes stretched. I did try and illustrate that over here by using the 1.5 punch. So these are some of the sort of 1.5 holes punched sort of normally, and then if I really push it in, you can see you do get a slightly bigger hole. So just be mindful when you are hammering the pressure that you're using. You want to be punching just enough to remove the leather, not to sort of stretch and damage the hole as you go through. So I am quite happy with that design. I'm going to use the wider 1.5 for the stem, and I'm going to use the 1 mil punch for the leaves, and I might take a little bit of artistic license and just make the smaller holes a fraction closer together, because I think that kind of helps to give a nice bit of detail, and it did work on this one as well. Once you are happy with your design, I would then recommend just tracing it again onto a separate sheet of tracing paper. So as I'm drawing it out, I've used my ruler to create the outline, and that will help me line it up on the back of my trank when I attach it to my pattern. And you will have noticed as well, because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, that I've actually just done the dots as part of the design, because I don't need to change the position of anything. I can see where everything is going to be going, so you can see there that I don't want to necessarily have to mark out the dots again. So I will just glue this down onto my trank. I will then use the awl to pierce through the tracing paper and the card, so that just as we did before, so I know exactly where the holes are going to go. And I will then, once I am drawing my design onto the leather, I will then transfer the markings as I am drawing out onto the leather, so that everything is marked up.